Thank you. While they bring up my slide deck, I'll go ahead and let you know that what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening is my epiphany, and it's one that's born over 50 years, actually more than that. But it's come to me quite recently, and it may sound cliche, but like Becky said, the title is Inspire Me Please, and the backdrop of that slide gives you an idea of what it was that inspired me. Not just Star Trek as a franchise, but also science fiction in general. The wonderful thing about science fiction, and it was to me science fantasy, and we'll revisit that idea in just a minute, is that we're currently going through, and you've probably seen it on Twitter, the 50th anniversary of the Star Trek franchise. Right arrow? Okay. The 50th anniversary of the Star Trek franchise. And the amazing thing to me about that is that for the last 50 years, that franchise has not only inspired me, and I'm an English teacher by trade, but I'm also the administrator of a STEM academy here in Knoxville. And more importantly, it has inspired generation after generation of young scientists. I live with one of those scientists. He's kind of an engineer. He lives in my basement. Someday maybe he won't. But but right now he lives in my basement. And the great thing about him living in my basement is I get to see everything that he does. And so before we get to that slide, I want to tell you a quick story. About 6 years ago, when he was an undergrad at the University of Tennessee in engineering, my son changed the way I think about young people. We had one of the old LCD big plastic box televisions. Many of you may remember those. It was the last iteration before the wall-mounted flat screen. And one day that TV just went kaput. It just stopped. No picture, no nothing. And he asked me, he said, "Dad, what are you going to do with that?" And I said, "Well, I'll probably haul it to the dump." And he said, "Can I have it?" And I thought, "Really? What are you going to do with it?" He said, "I'm going to try to fix it." I said, "Okay, we'll do that." And so I gave him the television. And in the meantime, Becky and I went out and we got ourselves our first flat screen TV. A couple of weeks later, packages started arriving in the mail. They were from China and Japan. And then he came to me and he said, "Can we go buy a soldering iron?" And I said, "Sure." And so a few weeks later, guess what? The TV works, and it works beautifully, as well as it did when it was brand new. And of course, I consider myself fairly crafty. I can remodel a bathroom. I've got a garage full of tools. I can do some basic plumbing and some simple wiring, but I was aghast. My son had taken this complex machine and had made it work again. And I asked him, I said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "Well, I watched some videos on the internet and I troubleshot and I figured it out. I ordered the parts." And I said, "What are you going to do with it?" And he said, "Can I sell it?" I said, "Absolutely." And I said, "How much have you got in it?" And he said, "About $30. Those parts that came in his labor, $30. So I'm amazed at what he's been able to do. The next iteration of his work is here on the screen. Now he's a grad student at UT and he's in aerospace engineering. And the rocket on the right-hand side is, he named Icarus 1. It's a high-power, 6-foot-tall rocket that he built. It's not a kit. He built it himself. The only real parts that he ordered were the motor itself. And on Memorial Weekend, just recently, Becky and I went down to Tullahoma, Tennessee with Buck, and we watched him launch this rocket 2 days in a row. He launched it on Saturday, and then he launched it again on Sunday. We bought a second motor while we were there. And so I'm going to give you just a second to look at this video and see what we saw him do that weekend.
George Ashe flying an Icarus 1 on a Cicerone I-165. We have a 10-second motor delay.
As soon as we get the launch, we can move on. While it's buffering, I'll go ahead and tell you what's happened to my thought in the process. As I've watched him and I've watched the young people that I work with at Hardin Valley Academy, one of the things that I've realized is that young people can do amazing things, but sometimes the structures, the educational structures that we put in place, act as boundaries to their creativity, and I'll develop that idea as we move along. But again, I am constantly inspired now by what the young people around me are doing. And I take that thinking back to my own training as a professional in the education world. As a British Lit instructor, one of the most important novels that I ever read was George Orwell's 1984. Many of you may have read that novel as well. And if you have, you remember that the protagonist, Winston, at one moment, and it was a pivotal moment for me, was standing in the square and there were a couple of hundred people hustling and bustling, trying to get their hands on a limited number of pots and pans which were in short supply. And two women specifically were about to come to blows. And he admired for a moment the vehemence of their arguments with one another, but then he said to himself, and this is the part that always resonated with me, why is it that they never argue about things that really matter? Here they were arguing over pots and pans. And in our day-to-day, one of the things that I realize is that we ourselves often slip into the everyday and the mundane, but what I really want to see our young people do is question deeply and to ask questions that really matter. And I know they're thinking them.
George Ashe flying an Icarus 1 on a Cicerone I-165. We have a 10-second motor delay.
Come on.
Pad 41, going in 5, 4,
Here we go.
3, 2, 1.
What is 10 seconds readout?
When you find a quick boosting,
We have an event.
oh yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
That's gonna drift forever. Wait,
What is that separated?
that's the bottom of it.
So that was an exciting moment for me. And it's funny that it comes on the heels of Father's Day, because dads all wonder, what is it that I'm imparting to my child? What am I leaving to my son? My son is obviously willing to question his world. And that, as I said earlier, that's what I want to see. I want to see people question and not be afraid to push the limits. So I'm looking for questions out of our young people that really matter. Questions like, how do we explore our universe? How do we go faster, farther, safer? How do we decrease our dependency on fossil fuels? Or questions like, and before I change the slide, back to Star Trek and my sci-fi affiliation, I've always watched spaceships land themselves. But like I said, that was fantasy until this year, wasn't it? And then SpaceX lands their rocket on a barge in the ocean, and I'm amazed. So, another great question I'd like to hear my students ask is, how do we provide fresh water to a thirsty planet? What's happening? What's in our groundwater? What is climate change doing to our fresh water at the polar caps? How do we feed and house 7.4 billion people? What are those structures going to be made of? What is the process for producing food for that number of people? And what's in the food? How do we appropriately use technology? Many of you are probably aware of this. This was all over Twitter, where these young ladies used technology to design a prosthetic for a dog. Again, I am constantly amazed at what our young people can do. I'm reading a book right now. It's by Maria Konnikova, and it's called Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. And in that, she says, we use the best metric of the future, the past. It's natural to do so, but that doesn't mean it's accurate. The past doesn't make room for the improbable. Again, I want our young people to realize they can dream big. They can imagine great things. Things that to many of us seem like fantasy, because many of those things will no longer be fantasy if they put their efforts to them. I watched a YouTube video the other day, and in that YouTube video, Omar Chowdhury said, metacognition is a form of humility. As we dismiss prior concepts, new questions arise and our thinking evolves. Therefore, the boundaries of our ignorance increase. And I ruminated on that quote. It just struck me. I thought there's something really powerful there. And I started thinking about all of the great, sweeping intellectual changes we have encountered as humanity. And every one of those allowed us to leap forward, but at the same time, with some humility, reminded us of how little we still know, and therefore why we should still question, why we should still dream big and overcome what we perceive as fantasy. So what is the classroom like that I want to work in? I want to work in a classroom where young people have voice and choice, where they ask those deep questions, where we do read Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Then we explore the Black Death. And then we compare and contrast what we've learned with the spread of HIV or the Zika virus. And then we use computational math to try to eradicate those diseases. That world is out there. We just have to open our minds and think outside the box and let our students ask those powerful questions that I know they're thinking. One of the greatest moments in our history as a nation was in 1962 at Rice University when President John F. Kennedy said this to the nation: we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. And so I leave you today with a simple thought. And before I do, let me go one step back in that same speech when he said to that group at Rice University, before that quote, why does Rice play Texas? It was a great question for Rice University because at that time in 1962, Rice was 2 wins and 43 losses to Texas. But we know, all of us in this room right here know the answer to that question. Steel sharpens steel. Great challenges bring out the best in all humans. So, where will the inspiration come from for our young people? Thank you.